One of the many intriguing differences that people first notice between the Eastern and Western traditions of Christianity is the difference in the date of Christmas, with January 7th being colloquially called Orthodox Christmas, to set it apart from the Western celebration that takes place on December 25th. But how old is this difference, and what caused it? Stick around to learn the answer to this question and more. Before we can discuss the date of Christmas, we must first look at why we celebrate it. As we all know, Christianity is a fulfillment of the Jewish religion. The Jewish religion had 7 major feasts. As a fulfillment of Judaism, Christianity adopted these feasts, interpreting each within the lens of Christ's salvation. Christianity was not simply a new form of Judaism, however. It was a fulfillment of God's covenant with all mankind. Thus, from the very start, many Gentiles joined in the new covenant. These Gentiles, who were used to celebrating not only their own birthdays, but also the birthdays of their pagan gods, upon their conversion to Christianity, began to commemorate the birth of Christ. These celebrations were mostly idea feasts. Their aim was not to commemorate the exact date of the event of Christ's birth, but rather to celebrate the salvation achieved through Christ's incarnation. This resulted in a lack of uniformity for the date of the feast. From Saint Clement of Alexandria, we learned that there were numerous dates for the birth of Christ. From among these many competing dates, 2 would become dominant. In the East, the 11th of Tuba, January 6th on the Julian calendar, became the dominant celebration and was known as the Feast of the Theophany. The Greek word theophany means appearance of God, and the feast commemorates both the Nativity of Christ and his baptism in the Jordan River, with both being events in which God manifested himself to mankind. This day would also later become associated with Christ's first miracle, the changing of water to wine at the wedding in Cana of Galilee. While the earliest records of this date comes from the aforementioned writings of Clement of Alexandria, it is believed that this date for the celebration may have been Syrian or Anatolian in origin. In the West, Christians began to commemorate the Nativity on the 25th of December, which corresponds to the 29th of Kiak on the Coptic calendar. The earliest mention of this date comes from the early 4th century chronograph of 354 AD. Many Christians in the West also observe January 6th. In addition to all the Eastern commemorations on that day, Christians in the West also commonly associated this day with the Magi's visit. The reason that these 2 dates were most popular is not exactly certain. The most likely reason is that these dates resulted from symbolic calculations. While the Nativity of Christ was not celebrated by the Church in the 1st century, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ certainly were. These feasts were tied to the Jewish feast of the Passover, with Christ being crucified on the 14th of Nisan, the day of the slaughtering of the Passover lambs. Some Christians in Asia Minor claimed that the 14th of Nisan would correspond to April 6th, while the majority of Christians claimed it was March 25th. By that point in time, it had become common belief that the Annunciation of Christ's birth to the Virgin and his resurrection took place on the same date. Since these dates were commonly believed to be the dates of the Annunciation, using them to calculate the birth of Christ would be very easy. Adding 9 months to these 2 dates would produce January 6th for the Anatolians and December 25th for the Romans and everyone else, demonstrating the possible origin of these 2 dates for the celebration. In addition to their symbolic nature coming 9 months after the Annunciation, both dates were close to the winter solstice. The solstice was a common date for pagan festivals such as the Saturnalia in Rome and Chronia in Egypt. The placement of the Feast of the Nativity close to these celebrations would have deterred Christians from participating in them. By the 5th century AD, for one reason or another, all churches began settling on December 25th, Kiak 29th, as the Feast of the Nativity, with the Feast of the Theophany on January 6th being preserved only as a commemoration of the baptism of Christ. The connection between these 2 feasts is still observable within the Coptic tradition with regards to the stringent Paramon fast which precedes them both. Such a fast isn't associated with any of the other major feasts. The only church which did not adopt December 25th as the Feast of the Nativity was the Armenian Church, which to this day doesn't celebrate the Nativity as an independent feast. So, If almost everyone in late antiquity settled on December 25th as the date of the Nativity, why is there division today? This goes back to the wandering nature of the Roman and Egyptian calendars. If you recall from our previous discussion of the Egyptian calendar, the ancient Egyptians had miscalculated the length of the year as 365 days, causing the calendar to fall back one day every 4 years. The Julian and Coptic calendars, in turn, aimed to fix the wandering issue by adding a leap day once every 4 years to bring the year up to 365 and a quarter days. However, this calculation was still not precise enough. The year is more precisely 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds long. While the ancient Egyptians had underestimated the length of the year by about a quarter day, the ancient Greeks had overshot it by a little over 12 minutes. While the difference was minute and unnoticeable at first, as hundreds of years passed, the difference accumulated, leading to dates jumping forward with regards to the equinox. In the 1500s, European scientists began reworking the formula for the length of the year. Their new calculation produced a year which was roughly 365.2425 days long, which was closer to the tropical year than the Julian calculation. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII issued a reform which skipped the calendar forward 10 days and applied the new formula for the length of the year, thereby limiting the noticeable drift. This newly reformed calendar was called the Gregorian Calendar. This reform would be adopted by the majority of countries today, but the Eastern churches, both the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, did not accept the reform. They would continue using the Julian calendar. As centuries continued to pass, the Julian calendar continued to drift so that December 25th now coincided with January 7th on the Gregorian calendar. In 1923, a new calendar, the revised Julian calendar, was created by a Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic. This calendar is even more accurate in its calculation than the Gregorian calendar, giving a year length of 365.2422. While many Eastern Orthodox churches adopted this calendar and have thus reconciled the date of Christmas with the Gregorian calendar, the largest of the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Russian Church, has not. They, alongside other churches, continue to use the old Julian calendar. While the Coptic Orthodox Church celebrates the Nativity on what is essentially January 7th on the Gregorian calendar, it is important to note that this is simply because the Coptic Church doesn't recognize the Gregorian reform and still uses the original Julian calendar. The Church views the feast as still occurring on the same day as it has for centuries, Kiak 29th of the Coptic calendar, December 25th of the Julian calendar. Reforming the Coptic calendar to better reflect the actual length of the year and provide unity of feast dates with other Christians is the goal of many within the Coptic Church. But many more cannot distinguish between holy tradition and simple traditions, and thus, as with everything else, change is nearly impossible. Thus, while modern apostolic churches may differ within their actual practice on when they celebrate the Feast of the Nativity, they have all agreed since the 5th century AD that it should be celebrated on December 25th. They just haven't agreed on when exactly December 25th is. Hopefully, within the near future, the calendar issue will be resolved, restoring unity to the Christian celebration of all feasts. As for now, regardless of which December 25th you celebrate, I wish you a blessed Feast of the Nativity. Christos genate doxasate.